The end of the Second World War and the defeat of the Japanese left 2,000 Dutch civilians trapped in an East Indies jungle camp. For 3 years, they'd been held captive by Japanese soldiers under brutal conditions. Now, an Indonesian revolution threatened. The mission to rescue them fell to Canadian Joan Bamford Fletcher. To accomplish her assignment in one of war's odd twists of fate, she was to command 70 Japanese soldiers. During 7 weeks of daring mountain convoys, they were her drivers and guards. The troops called her too tough. That's what it took to accomplish the rescue from Sumatra.
I think that, strangely enough, there's a reservoir of courage in everyone, but it's only in certain situations that they suddenly find themselves face to face with a decision and they rise to it. You know, in a second they can be heroines or heroes.
Life began for Joan Bamford Fletcher in 1918 on a small horse ranch just outside Regina, Saskatchewan. Her parents emigrated from England, where her father's family made their fortune in cotton. Joan grew up with her 2 sisters, Bunny and Madge.
She was an adventurous type. She just had to see beyond the horizon, as you might say. It was all, you know, all prairie and that sort of thing, but she was always wandering off and going and doing her own thing.
In the 1920s, the girls were sent to boarding school in England.
My father and mother thought that we were safer in convents because the nuns were dedicated, you see.
The Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur Convent stressed helping the poor and an independent spirit. Women ought to be able to do everything for themselves. Joan took those lessons to heart.
She never seemed afraid of anything. And when we were at boarding school, you know, and she'd sort of stick up for me. I was the eldest, but I was a timid one.
During breaks, the Fletcher girls stayed with relatives in the Lake District.
My father and his family obviously all knew them well, and as they spent the school holidays with my father's family. So they must have had a huge number of people in the house at any one time. I mean, walls must have been nearly pushed out.
Joan excelled socially and academically. After her schooling, she returned to Canada. When the Second World War broke out, she jumped at the chance to get back overseas.
The Canadians weren't recruiting women at that time, and that Joan was very anxious to get overseas, and so that's why she joined the Fannies, so that she could get overseas right away and not sit around waiting for the Canadians to form women's groups.
For an outgoing person, there couldn't have been a better fit. The Fanny, First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, is the oldest uniformed women's organization. It started in 1907 as a corps of women on horseback who retrieved wounded soldiers from the battlefield.
We are the most highly decorated women's organisation in the United Kingdom. The Fannies being volunteers, unpaid, and this is the point about the Fannies. Not only do you not get paid, you actually have to pay to join. There's a joining fee. It really did attract women who wanted to do something different. It was into the Fanny that Joan was actually recruited.
These women were mountain climbers, and
good horseback riders and hunted and so on. They were women that were ready to try things.
Driving was the entry into the Fanny. Intense training at Pettram Park included signals, codes, first aid, shooting, and knowing everything about a vehicle.
We had to do our maintenance of the cars. We had to grease them and keep the maintenance going and know the engines and all that. So there were pits for us to run the cars over. And we went down in these damp pits and stayed down there for however long it took. So it was quite hard work, but it was interesting work. We drove staff cars or ambulances, trucks sometimes, trucks in convoy up and down the hills of Scotland in icy weather. That was something.
Fannies were stalwart and resilient. Some became interpreters, decoders, secret agents dropped behind enemy lines. No one shirked responsibility.
There's no sort of escape from duties in the Fanny, whoever you are and however high you rise. Yeah? You will have scrubbed the floor, served on tables, along with everybody.
During the Second World War, many of the Fanny were stationed in Scotland, assisting the exiled Polish army. Joan was among them.
I met her at one of the Polish headquarters because we were driving, besides ambulances, some of us were driving officers. They didn't really have enough trained personnel to drive all what the needs they had. So she was there.
We were stationed in Moncrief House when the Canadian Fannies came, expecting a very cold winter, and there was Joan in a completely, she looked like somebody from Mars. And all the Canadian Fannies were in these outfits for going to bed. They were red flannel, things like combinations covering the hands and feet, and they're bright red. You know, we'd never seen anything like it. They were an astounding thing, these Canadian Fannies. We had never seen anything like them, and we liked them straight away.
This tight-knit sisterhood was strong-willed.
They did become known for not liking bull, not liking military discipline very much. They did tend to be out of the ordinary, ones who were less inclined to do as they were told unless they saw a good reason for doing it.
Women in the Fanny were also loyal and dedicated. In September 1944, Joan was promoted to Lance Corporal, later Lieutenant. Within 6 months, she was assigned to the Far East.
My last vision of her, she was riding pillion on the back of a motorbike, driven by a very dodgy-looking sergeant. And, you know, none of us would have gone near him. We'd have been terrified, absolutely terrified. But there she was, waving us goodbye with a grin on her face, you know, and absolutely no fear of anything, even the sergeant. She was amazing, she was.
The arena of war for Joan became the Pacific. When she arrived in the spring of 1945, the battle was far from over. For years, Imperial Japan had been annexing land and fighting to expand its empire. Sumatra was a key acquisition. Situated on a strategic trading route, part of the 13,000 islands of the East Indies, it had vast resources of oil, rubber, and timber. For over 300 years, it had been governed by the Dutch. When Holland fell under Nazi rule, Sumatra became vulnerable. It braced for conflict with Japanese troops on a divine mission for Emperor Hirohito.
You are heaven-sent soldiers, and the time has come for you to die with smiles on your faces for the liberation of the peoples of Greater East Asia who are oppressed by Anglo-American domination. The present operation is truly the supreme climax of our entire battle for the Dutch East Indies.
On the 14th of February, 1942, Japanese airborne units invaded southern Sumatra and captured Palembang's oil installations.
Facing this desperate resistance of the enemy, one section of our troops makes a frontal attack, while the other slips to the rear of the enemy.
After a month of heavy fighting, Japan defeated the Dutch East Indies Army.
The mainstay of the enemy forces, which greatly outnumbered our troops, tried to escape, while the Dutch technicians and enemy remnants surrendered to our forces and were made prisoners.
Already in the first week of April, the Dutch civilians, they were interned in prison camps. And mostly they were divided. The men were put apart, and the women and children as well.
For 3 years, all across Indonesia, Allied POWs and civilians waited for salvation. 3 years before Joan Bamford Fletcher's courage was put to the test, deep inside the jungles of interior Sumatra. In the spring of 1942, 100,000 civilians were interned on the East Indian Islands. They didn't know when or how they would get out.
2 days after my 12th birthday, all the European people were, of course, all gathered in interned camps. So it was not actually the Ritz. It was a jungle camp. After 9 months in the women camp, a bunch of boys was put into prison with the men. But my father was taken out of the jail, and he was killed by the Kempaitai. So I stayed by myself.
The Japanese conquerors of 1942 herded the Dutch into the most squalid of concentration camps. In their deliberate campaign to discredit white men in the eyes of the Indonesians, the occupation forces took every opportunity to humiliate and degrade them.
They treated the Dutch absolutely appallingly. They were imprisoned and they were bitterly maltreated, probably especially the women, many of whom became sex slaves.
There was harsh discipline. Twice a day, people had to line up like a military roll call. They had to bow in honor of the Japanese emperor. It was humiliating for most of them.
The harshness of the internees' lives was etched out in their many drawings and diaries. Trapped behind barbed wire, they worked as slave laborers, suffered their captors' wrath, and scrambled for food. They were defenseless against mosquitoes and disease.
People were getting sick. They were getting dysentery. They were getting bed bugs. They were getting odemia and what have you. Sores, tropical sores, and that sort of thing. So people were just dying. They were not killed, they were dying.
People were dying often of despair too. I can't imagine psychologically how those people actually survived at all, because there'd been so much despair and so much loss. But I can't think that they would have been physically or mentally in any condition to really to do anything at all.
Nothing was strange anymore. Everything was strange. The whole experience was strange. There were no surprises anymore.
Japan was now the protector of Asia.
Premier Tojo was welcomed to Indonesia by some native leaders, including the nationalist Sukarno, long a rebel against Dutch rule. These leaders, to whom the new master seemed no worse than the old, found in Japanese talk of Asia for the Asiatics hope of eventually achieving their one aim, independence.
The Japanese inflicted massive death tolls as they captured vast areas of the Pacific. Many loyal warriors sacrificed their lives for their emperor. By spring 1945, the Allies had wrestled with counter-offensive campaigns in China, Burma, India, and the Pacific Islands.
The war in Europe was obviously coming to an end, but the war in the Far East was still continuing. It was really quite bloody.
Lord Louis Mountbatten was Chief of Combined Operations, Supreme Allied Commander of the Southeast Asian Command.
Mountbatten had asked for women to come. He needed extra people for help, and this is a group that he felt could come.
The Fanny answered the call for assistance. Joan Bamford Fletcher traveled to the Far East, arriving in Calcutta, April 1945. By then, plans were well underway for an all-out offensive, with estimated Allied deaths of 500,000.
There was a plan to invade Japan, and a whole invasion flotilla had been formed in India.
As they strategized, the Fanny welfare work in the Far East continued.
Until you change trains in India, you just have never changed trains. 2 solid hours it took us, battling to the death to get our luggage off. A great rat jumped out of Barbara's drawer the other night, and scorpions wander across the floor of our straw hut. The other day, I came into my bedroom and found 6 monkeys in it.
The Japanese army began to lose outposts, but rejected Allied terms for surrender in July 1945. Instead, it ordered all prisoners to be killed upon the Allied invasion. 1 month later, atomic explosions leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese commanders and their emperor now agreed to Allied demands. The suddenness with which the war ended left some with an uncertain future.
Now, when the Japanese officially surrendered, the very, very large number of prisoners, both Far Eastern prisoners and European prisoners, were released from these camps in very bad condition, most of them. And so this welfare unit that the Fannies provided was specifically briefed to go and deal with this massive humanity.
We landed at Singapore 2 hours after VJ Day surrender terms were signed. Everywhere we went, the war prisoners crowded round and just stared and stared. And when we got them talking, they could not stop.
It was another 4 weeks before Joan would arrive in the jungles of Sumatra. For the captives, relief was a long time coming.
In the aftermath of war, don't just assume that peace breaks out. It takes a long time in the Indonesian archipelago for forces of the Allies, principally Dutch and British, to arrive to accept the surrender of those Japanese camps. So in the interim, any nationalist forces that exist are largely given free rein to run amok wherever they see fit.
In the East Indies, nationalists quickly declared their independence from Holland. This didn't bode well for Dutch civilians held in Bangkanang, Sumatra prison camps. With no word, the war was over.
the news was not spread into the camps, and only August 22nd it was told by the camp commander. People started to sing the national anthem of Holland. Other songs were sung. All of a sudden there was the national flag, the red, white and blue flag. It was in hiding for many years, and now it was taken just to fly over the camp now.
What we thought when we were free, we could go back to the places where we came from. That was not true. We had to stay on the place where we were. Because Lord Louis Mountbatten had said that the Japanese were responsible for our safety. And the best place to put us in is in the camps, keep us there.
The political face of Asia quickly changed as Indonesians fought against the return of Dutch colonial power. Enemies became allies, and prison guards became protectors, much to the dismay of the internees.
There were no Allied troops to liberate the camps. Now those Japanese guards had to protect the prisoners from attacks from outside.
The Japanese were terrified themselves. They were far away from home. The Japanese government had collapsed. There was apparently no plan to save them. They didn't know how they were going to get back to Japan. The Dutch were simply terrorized. And that's the situation that Miss Fletcher came into. Complete tropical chaos.
In September 1945, Sumatra was a sea of hostility. Indonesian nationalists threatened to kill those who had survived the Japanese internment camps. Lady Edwina Mountbatten was sent to assess the situation. She reported it was desperate. A mission to rescue them was urgent.
Lieutenant Joan Bamford Fletcher, she was asked if she'd go on a rather unusual and possibly a very dangerous assignment. It was to go to Sumatra and find about 2,000 women and children who were in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in the middle of the jungle and bring them back to the coast to safety.
The operation was delicate. 7 members of Force 136 were sent ahead to gather intelligence and prepare internees for evacuation. They also transferred Japanese guards to Fort de Kock, where Joan later met them.
We went in on the 5th of October. I was given the job of evacuating all the internees from Bangkanang camp to Padang. I arranged with the Japanese Army headquarters for a convoy of 15 vehicles, with 40 armed Japanese as guards. These trips were over 900 kilometers each way. It shook the Japanese a bit to find themselves under the command of a woman.
I remember a very healthy woman, quite sturdy, very decisive. I've always thought that the Japanese must have thought that I'm glad that our women in Japan are from another creation.
Normally speaking, I think Japanese officers would not have expected to take orders from any woman, let alone a foreign woman. But these weren't normal times, and I think their first thought was that vengeance couldn't be very far away.
Using the Japanese as drivers held risk. The journey out was through the steep volcanic Barizong Mountains. There was fear the Japanese, shamed by their military defeat, might drive with their prisoners over the mountain cliffs. To ensure her orders were followed, Joan needed a translator. She demanded the services of Art Miyazawa, an English-speaking Japanese soldier.
She said, I would like him. They said, well, he's only a sergeant. She said, then make him anything you like overnight. But she said, I want him.
She realized when she got there she couldn't possibly take them all in one go. She had to do it in about 20 different journeys. And so she had to make these journeys one after another. And the Indonesian population was not very friendly. In fact, there were a couple of confrontations at the time which she had to try and handle herself. She was the only woman and in charge, and the Japanese couldn't understand, of course, that a woman was in charge too.
Joan still had 539 men and 1,244 women and children to escort from Bangkenang to Padang, when the Indonesian rebel leader announced 4 more days of guaranteed safety. Each trip took 12 hours.
We were lifted into the trucks, which were actually the same trucks as the Japs used to bring us there. Transports were on average 180 persons, in comparison with 500 when the Japs did that.
I ran the first convoy on October 12th. Personnel trucks in front, baggage at the rear, with a repair car at the tail end.
Sumatra, of course, is a very rugged country. It's mountainous, tropical jungle. It's very, very rugged terrain. Through this rugged terrain, there is one road over the mountains, which passes the equator. But to come up to the mountains, you have a lot of hairpin loops. That's what the road is.
The roads were narrow and very rough. I had a 5-minute stop each hour for the women and children. Lunch was arranged for us at the Gentram Hotel at Fort de Kock.
On some occasions the bridge over the river was destroyed and they had to make makeshift boats to cross the river. They have to carry the small parts of luggage over and the trucks had to be, by an improvised bridge had to cross the river.
The people had to debus at the bridge, walk across, and reload on the other side. The bridge definitely bending and swinging badly as the trucks went over. This process usually took about 2 hours.
Now this involved a journey of 500 miles, up mountains as much as 5,000 feet high, and the vehicles were always breaking down. At one point, because she was a very good car mechanic, she had to repair 2 lorries that were rather close together, and while she was doing it, there must have been a bit of a bump.
She was standing there, and she got rolled between the 2, and she went down, and that's when she cut her head.
I nearly got killed on the last convoy. My head split open, and the blood was terrific. I had stitches put in, but my God, I am black from head to heel now.
Now this would knock out any normal person, but not Joan. In 2 hours, she was ready again, back and carrying on with her vehicles.
People said, now stop, you go rest and stop your evacuation. But she didn't want to, and she kept on with the evacuation program, and because she got a lot of respect from not only from the prisoners but also from the Japanese soldiers who were with her.
My interpreter told me they'd discussed it that night. I had won the respect of every man in the convoy. After that, I never passed another Japanese on the road without being saluted.
I'd love to see her just sort of going in and saying, well, this is what we're going to do, follow me. And nobody really being in any state but to do anything else, but probably so glad that somebody was there to give some orders.
We usually arrived at Padang about 5:30 or 6 p.m., depending on how many breakdowns we had. You don't mind discomfort when it's necessary and the job is worthwhile.
At the port of Padang, Allied troops had arrived to provide security for the Dutch civilians.
When the British troops landed there, one little officer said something about, oh, well, we can relieve you now, we'll take over. Joan said, you won't take over at all. She said, I've started this, I'm going to finish it.
Sukarno's guaranteed 4 days of safety were up. 1,600 prisoners remained to be transported. Pressure mounted with each trip. Joan now boarded a jeep from Brigadier Hutchinson, commander of the 71st Indian Infantry Brigade. With her translator at the wheel, she roved up and down the transport columns. Driving roads with hairpin curves, barely clinging to the mountains, took on new terror as Sumatra entered its rainy season. Convoys continued through mud and breakdowns, with danger a close companion. October 13th, 1945. The Indonesian People's Army intensified its campaign against former prisoners of Japanese camps. These were the days of bersiap, the Malay word for beware. Young men called pemuda attacked and killed. There was no police force.
Towards the end of the convoys, the Indonesian situation had become rather tricky. I put a crash car at the head of the column with a big, wide bumper to crash the barricades they put on the roads. We had one bit of trouble on the second to last convoy.
She had a jeep in front with a Japanese officer and then a lorry of Japanese soldiers at the end of the convoy. And at one stop, one of the soldiers rushed up and said, they've got one of the Dutch.
I pulled the jeep up alongside, opened the door, and went on with my interpreter to find the two Dutch men. We found them in a small house with their personal effects on the table in front of them, and an Indonesian waving a great bloody knife in their faces, and the head man questioning them.
She grabbed a knife. She said they were so startled with the woman coming in, and she grabbed a knife and cut his rope and said, get going.
I was shrieking at the top of my voice just to keep my courage up, but they didn't understand a word of it. I added color by cursing a blue streak.
And then, she said, then I had to turn and walk out of the tent, and hoping I wouldn't get a knife in between my shoulder blades. So she had a lot of pluck.
As the Indonesian situation got worse, the last convoy had 70 Japs with machine guns mounted on the truck. It was fatal to stop. I made that crossing 20 times in 30 days, and then ran the last two convoys at 4-day intervals. I just loved every minute of it.
Our motto is actually arduous invicti, in difficulty undaunted, but unofficially it's always been translated as I cope. And I think that in the incident when Joan did rescue these Dutchmen, she could have, as they say, passed by. She was not obliged to get involved. She had her duty, which was to organise and accompany or arrange the evacuation of these internees, who were mostly women and children. And she chose to intervene. She just, she would not have passed by. That is not something the Fannies are trained to do. And I mean, I believe that she lived up to the whole ethos of the Corps.
Freedom had come for the internees from the Bangkanang camp, but Sumatra would never be the same. The Dutch lost their homes, and by 1949, lost all of the East Indies. This chain of events, which began with the Japanese occupation, left bitter feelings.
I don't think there is anybody in the camp that had any respect for the Japanese, at least not those. And well, I think Joan was in a very different position. In the first place, she was there because she was sent over there and she had the job to do. And she did a very good job there. We were liberated, and that was, of course, a relief.
After she evacuated these 2,000 people, one of the ladies there embroidered this handkerchief, and they gave it to Joan.
Word of the dangerous rescue quickly traveled. There was one unexpected acknowledgement.
The Japanese soldiers who'd been with her said that she was a very fine woman, but they wouldn't marry an English woman again because they were too tough. And the Japanese commander, because she'd been so tactful and so mannerable to the Japanese soldiers with her, handed her his sword, his samurai sword.
He said, "I'd like to give you my sword because you're the bravest woman I've ever seen." So that was how the sword came to her, which was it was a family sword. It was a very great honor. Yeah.
The captain of the motor koi thanked me for my courteous treatment of his men and presented me with his sword, in token, he said, of his respect and esteem. I felt very gratified.
The sword is the soul of the samurai. The sword is the most important for the Japanese people. It's not just the fighting weapon. It's the spirit of the Japanese warriors. Our soul will give to the other people as the very, very honorable way. So that's Mr. Tachibana. Truly believe that the Joan is the very honorable person, wonderful person.
Reporters went wild for the good news story of Joan and the honor of her Japanese sword. Magazines like Time and Soldier proclaimed her story.
It's simply extraordinary that the Japanese would so honor a representative of an allied power which had just recently defeated them is one thing, but that they would so honor a non-military representative of an allied power is something else entirely, and that person should be a woman who would assist them in effect in evacuating their former enemies is just positively striking. So this story, as I know the history of the Pacific War, is largely unique. There may be other examples, but I certainly don't know of any.
At the end of November 1945, Joan Bamford Fletcher was sent to Hong Kong for her next assignment.
3 weeks after flying out, I was in hospital, suffering from swamp fever. I was able to return to England in July, but the tropical disease attacked again, settling in the left jawbone.
She had to lose half her bottom teeth, and they had to scrape away part of the jaw, and it's plastic. It was replaced with plastic.
Once she recovered, reporters clamored for her comments. What was she going to do next? Joan announced she'd taken a job at a British consulate in Poland. That's where the powder keg is, you know. By 1946, Joan Bamford Fletcher was based in Warsaw with the information section of the British Embassy. While there, she received a telegram from England.
We are pleased to inform you that His Majesty the King has approved award of MBE to you for services in Far East. Stop. Award published London Gazette of 29 October. E.H. Coleman, Under Secretary of State.
It was, I think, a vindication of the human spirit. One felt very humble and then somewhat buoyed up that such courage could exist.
I was more than delighted to hear. No decoration has been better deserved. You may indeed go home with proper pride in a grand job well done.
The British ambassador to Poland presented her with the decoration, and my father happened to be listening to the news, and I was absolutely thrilled.
Resilience is something that's tested. Joan faced a new crisis in 1950. She came face to face with the new Cold War. A phone rang in Iron Curtain, Warsaw. Communist police had already made arrests. They're after you. Get out.
Joan was horrified, and so when she went home that day after work, she took her address book out and burned all the dresses that she had of different Poles in Warsaw that had been friendly with her. And for her, which was fortunate, the British found out and came to her as soon as she came to work and said, "We're taking you out, you're going."
People used to disappear. I think they were probably taken away and shot, and I think it was a very nasty experience. And she had to wave when she got on the plane. She was in such a state, she had to get somebody else to wave for her. And that was the embassy would know then that she got on the plane. Otherwise, they were going to sort of raise the roof with the Polish authorities.
I'm currently bound by the Official Secrets Act. All I will say about it is I have no doubt that her activities in Poland were probably inspired by the same sense of courage, commitment to freedom, and devotion to duty, as well as an unwillingness to just pass by, shall we say. She would intervene where she could, and if she could, she would never have turned aside if people needed help.
In Canada, Joan's mother was ill. She returned to be with her and raise horses. Her time for making headlines was over. The bond she'd formed with her Japanese translator, and later his family, continued across 2 continents and many years. When she died in 1979, Joan's sisters scattered her ashes into the Pacific Ocean. Art Miyazawa traveled from Tokyo to deliver a eulogy from the Japanese troops she commanded.
Lieutenant Fletcher was included in the unit's honor roll of deceased members. Virtually every veteran present recalled the tough but fair-minded woman lieutenant who amazed our troops. To have earned the love and respect of one's former enemy is a unique accomplishment. It was a great wonder. Her courage cannot be praised too well. Perhaps she has no living equal. I recall her greatness particularly. May Miss Lieutenant Fletcher's soul sleep peacefully.
Yamashite Butai's words to her and her samurai sword now reside at the Canadian War Museum. The extraordinary courage of Joan Bamford Fletcher has taken on mythic proportions. The story of the Canadian who was too tough continues to inspire.
Well, she astounded me, really. She was full of character, very tough, very tough. You don't come across 2 people like that, in your time. You don't. If somebody had said to us, "Oh, she's booked to go to the moon," none of us would have said how extraordinary. We'd have said, "Well, I suppose she is," She was like that.